Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the panel for their testimony as well. I have several questions. The first is I'd like to follow up on something that Mr. Malpass addressed, which is the increase in the debt limit. And you've advocated that we make some structural changes, essentially, to get this escalating deficit and debt under control. I happen to share the view that we should make structural changes. We might have difference as to exactly which ones to make, but I do think it's very important that we use this occasion to begin to get our long-term spending problem under control. So I'm not in the camp that argues that under no circumstances should we raise the debt limit. I also accept your general premise that it's a rather blunt instrument, and the disruptions that would occur are to be avoided if we can. However, I think it's very important as we approach this that we understand exactly what might occur and what would not occur if there is some period of time during which we do not raise the debt limit upon reaching it. So my first question is a simple and factual historical question, and that is it true that we have had recent episodes in the past several decades where we have reached our debt limit, we have not raised it immediately upon reaching it, and we nevertheless did not default on the marketable debt securities issued by the government?
To me, sir, yes. In the late 1990s, there was a period of roughly 4 years. It's on page 9 of my testimony. My view is those were rather unique years. One of the things that was happening was defense spending was being cut sharply. Another thing that was happening was there was a temporary slowdown in the entitlement spending. It had to do with the generation, the baby boom had not yet started to retire. So on page 9 it goes through those. Also in those years something was happening, here it is on the screen. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were really ramping up, which operated almost like government spending. Remember, they were kind of off budget, and yet they are really ending up being taxpayer liabilities. So that helped paper over that particular period of time. I don't think we could mimic that right now.
Well, but let me, if I could interrupt for just a second. The point is that for a short period of time, the debt limit was not raised.
Correct.
And when the debt limit is not raised, is it true that tax revenue still comes in?
That's right. Money floods in.
Right. And next year, for instance, if my numbers are right, something on the order of 70% of all the money that the government is expected to spend is going to come in the form of tax revenue. Is that true?
Yes.
And something on the order of 6% of all the money the government is going to spend is currently scheduled for interest on our debt. So I guess the question is it possible for the Treasury, in the event that the debt ceiling is not raised, and acknowledging that this is in some ways a disruptive thing if that doesn't happen, but that the Treasury could nevertheless ensure that those people holding the marketable securities of this government would receive their interest payments, and that those payments can be made?
Yes, that's plausible. The fiscal deficit is large now, so each month the government is in a negative cash flow of roughly $120 billion. So what would happen each week is someone, meaning the Treasury Department or you members of Congress, would have to be deciding who not to pay.
Right.
And my concern is the disruption.
I understand this is very disruptive, and I've acknowledged this. The point is a narrow point, and that is, do those people holding securities necessarily need to not get their interest or principal payments? And I think you're acknowledging that. Yes, sir.
Senator, I think you're playing with fire in this scenario. One point that wasn't covered in David's otherwise comprehensive review of the debt situation is our borrowing from abroad. You have to remember that it's not just an internally funded debt. We're the world's largest borrower. This is very dangerous. There are alternative assets out there in the world. I know that the Eurozone doesn't look very appealing right now, but I think they will turn themselves around. The Chinese are working very hard to create alternative reserve assets, including the renminbi. I really don't think that you want to create potential disruptions of this kind, because there's nothing that says that the dollar has to be the #1 reserve asset forever. And the British pound lost this position earlier in the 20th century exactly through fiscal irresponsibility and global overreach.
Yeah. I would simply argue that I think the fiscal irresponsibility is what has gotten us into this situation, and the refusal to do anything about it is the worst message we could send to the market. The fact that revenue will be more than 10 times the expected cost of interest makes it very clear to me that no responsible Treasury Secretary would ever allow a default to occur on our debt. It would be so disruptive and so damaging to our entire economy, to the millions of savers, Americans as well as others, that I can't foresee how a Treasury Secretary would permit that to happen when he or she would have more than 10 times the revenue needed to prevent it from happening. Let me move on to another question, if I could, and that is, as alarming as the magnitude of the debt that we've discussed today is, I may have missed this, but I don't recall a discussion about another component that worries me. In fact, I would argue is even bigger than what we've talked about, and that is the unfunded liabilities implicit in the promises we've made through the big entitlement programs. And if you quantified the present value of that shortfall, is it true that that is actually several multiples of the actual publicly traded debt that we have?
Yes, it is, Senator. It is, and obviously, different calculations will give you different results. But I think everybody agrees that the present value of those liabilities is enormous. Right. In fact, if you add up Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, you come up with an unfunded liability when added to the debt really would exceed the value of the assets that David showed in his charts. Beyond that, if you look at another issue, which is the unfunded liabilities of state and local governments, those which are on the books as the gap between the promises they've made for their pensions and the assets that they have, as well as the unfunded liabilities for the health care promises that they've made, that would add on top of the federal liabilities to what you're talking about. So the answer is definitively yes, and resoundingly so.
But we also need to add and score appropriately the contingent liabilities that arise out of the financial sector, because we just pushed up debt by 40 percentage points of GDP because of the way the financial sector blew itself up. So I think all of this needs to be included, and I think we agree on that.
And can I add one more? I agree with those points. The actual size of government is going to go on. 50 years from now, there's going to be a defense budget. So I think, and there's going to be probably a federal education budget and so on. So I think as you think about the problem, I'm not as focused on dividing entitlements from discretionary spending. They're all commitments to the people that there's going to be a government in the next generation and the next, and we just don't have the money for it right now.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired. If there's time at a future round, I'd like to address yet another respect in which I think this problem is even worse, and that's something that Mr. Malpass mentioned briefly, which is what strikes me as potentially a very optimistic forecast about the level of interest rates. And when, of course, you have a huge debt, if you're wrong about your optimistic forecasts about interest rates, then that has devastating consequences. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that point.